The first scream on the 911 recording was raw, a sound torn from the deepest part of the soul, followed by a choked, desperate sob. "My husband! Oh God, he's on the floor! There's so much blood!" The dispatcher's calm, practiced voice was a stark contrast to the caller's hysteria. But Detective Keishan Parker had heard this duet of panic and procedure 1,000 times. It was the soundtrack of his life. He navigated his unmarked sedan through the rain-slicked streets of a sleeping Atlanta suburb. The call had come in at 12:45 a.m., dragging him from a rare moment of peace. This neighborhood, Cascade Heights, was one of those pockets of the city that defied simple categorization. Manicured lawns and two-story brick homes spoke of black middle-class success, a testament to dreams realized. But Parker knew that violence didn't check zip codes or credit scores. It was an opportunistic predator, and tonight, it had found a home on Sycamore Ridge Drive. Flashing blue and red lights painted the dripping trees in garish colors. Parker pulled up behind a patrol car, the rhythmic thump of his windshield wipers counting down the seconds until he had to step into another family's worst nightmare. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, the scent of stale coffee and worn leather filling the car. His partner for the night, Detective Dempsey, a 30-year veteran with a perpetually sour expression and a gut that strained the buttons of his shirt, was already at the yellow tape. "Evening, Keishan," Dempsey grunted, his voice a gravelly mix of boredom and cynicism. "Looks like another domestic gone sideways. They always do." Parker ignored the casual prejudice in his partner's tone. To Dempsey, any crime in a black neighborhood was just another one of those. It was a lazy, dangerous assumption that closed cases before they were even opened. "Victim?" Parker asked, ducking under the tape. "Elijah Brooks, 34, financial analyst downtown. Wife found him, Nia Brooks. She's a nurse over at Grady. Says she just got home from her shift." Parker stepped inside, and the sterile smell of a crime scene hit him, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the acrid scent of gunpowder. But underneath it all was something else, something homey and jarringly out of place. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The living room was immaculate, save for the chaos at its center. Elijah Brooks lay sprawled on a cream-colored rug, his lifeblood forming a dark, obscene flower on the fibers. He was dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt, as if he'd been waiting up for someone. A single neat hole marred his chest. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, with a look of profound surprise. "CSU says single shot, close range, no weapon on scene," Dempsey reported, pointing with a pen. "No signs of forced entry. Back doors locked, windows are secure. Looks like he let his killer in." Parker's eyes scanned the room, absorbing every detail. This wasn't the frenzied scene of a domestic dispute. Nothing was overturned. No lamps were broken. It was orderly. Too orderly. His gaze landed on the coffee table. 2 ceramic mugs sat there. One was black, half full. The other was a delicate white, also half full, with a perfect crescent-shaped smear of dark red lipstick on the rim. "She said she just got home from her shift?" Parker asked, his voice low. "Yeah, that's her story," Dempsey shrugged. "Probably came home. They had a fight. She popped him. And now she's playing the grieving widow. It's the oldest story in the book." Parker knelt, careful not to disturb anything. The lipstick was a bold, confident color, the kind a woman wears when she wants to make a statement. It wasn't the faded end-of-a-12-hour shift lipstick of a tired nurse. It was fresh. He looked at the victim again. The surprise on his face wasn't the shock of a heated argument turning deadly. It was the shock of betrayal. He knew his killer, and he hadn't seen it coming. "Where is she?" Parker asked, standing up. "In the kitchen with a uniform. She's a wreck." Parker walked into the kitchen. Nia Brooks sat at a small breakfast table, her body trembling. She was in her late 20s, dressed in blue scrubs, her face streaked with tears and mascara. A uniformed officer stood awkwardly in the corner. She looked up as Parker entered, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm Detective Parker. I am so sorry for your loss," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He wasn't here to offer comfort. He was here to find the cracks in her story. "I know this is an impossible time, but I need to ask you a few questions." She nodded, clutching a paper towel in her fist. I got home a little while ago, from my shift at the hospital. The door was unlocked, which was strange. I called his name, and then I saw him. She broke down into a fresh wave of sobs. "You work at Grady Memorial?" "Yes," she whispered. "I'm an ER nurse. I started my shift at 7 p.m. yesterday. I was there all night. An alibi, a solid one, easily verifiable. Dozens of witnesses, security cameras, time cards." Parker felt a familiar prickle of intrigue. Dempsey saw an open and shut case, a wife's crocodile tears. But Parker saw the lipstick on the mug. He saw the unsettling tidiness of the room, and he saw the look in the dead man's eyes. This wasn't just another domestic dispute. This was something else entirely. Someone had sat here, drinking coffee with Elijah Brooks, shortly before putting a bullet in his heart. And if it wasn't the hysterical woman in the scrubs, then who was it? The quiet, successful facade of this home had been shattered, and Parker knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the truth was buried somewhere deep beneath the lies that were only just beginning to be told. "You were at the hospital the entire night, Mrs. Brooks? From 7 p.m. until you came home after midnight?" Parker asked, his pen poised over his notepad. The kitchen was cold, the bright overhead light making Naya's pale, tear-stained face look almost translucent. "Yes, detective. My whole shift," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "It was a busy night. A multi-car pile-up on the I-20. We were swamped. You can ask anyone. Dr. Evans, my charge nurse Sarah, they were with me. There are cameras everywhere. I punched in at 6:52 p.m. and I never left the building until my shift ended." Her story was seamless, delivered with the conviction of truth. Parker made a note. An ER nurse at Grady on a Friday night. It was an airtight alibi. Dempsey, leaning against the doorframe, rolled his eyes, clearly convinced this was all a performance. But Parker knew grief, and he knew deceit. Naya Brooks seemed to be exhibiting a genuine, shattering form of the former. Still, the image of the lipstick-stained mug in the living room wouldn't leave his mind. "Was your husband expecting anyone tonight?" Nia shook her head, twisting the damp paper towel in her hands. "No, not that I know of. He was working from home, finishing up a portfolio for a client. He said he was just going to have a quiet night in." "Did you speak to him at all during your shift?" "I texted him around 9 p.m. to see how he was doing," she said, her voice catching. He texted back, "All good, love you." That was the last time I heard from him. She choked on the words, her shoulders shaking. Parker gave her a moment. Pushing too hard, too fast, would only make her shut down. "Mrs. Brooks, I have to ask this. It's standard procedure. Were there any problems between you and your husband? Any recent arguments? Anyone who might have wished him harm?" A flicker of something, hesitation, maybe even anger, crossed her face before it was replaced by sorrow. It was almost imperceptible, but Parker saw it. "We were married for 5 years, detective. Of course, we had disagreements. Every couple does. But nothing that would lead to this." "What kind of disagreements?" Parker pressed gently. She looked away, focusing on a magnet on the refrigerator, a smiling photo of her and Elijah on a beach. "It was a family matter. It's personal." "In a homicide investigation, nothing is personal," Parker said, his voice hardening slightly. "A man is dead in your living room. Every detail matters." Nia took a deep, shuddering breath. "My sister Zira," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "She and her husband Tavon. They can't have children. They've tried everything for years. IVF, treatments. Nothing worked. Her doctor told her last year that carrying a baby to term would be impossible for her. Surrogacy was their last hope." She paused, gathering herself. "They wanted the baby to be genetically connected to our family. Tavon has his own issues. So Zira asked Elijah. She asked him to be the donor." Parker stopped writing, his eyes fixed on her. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt heavy. "And what was his response?" "He refused," Naya said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "He said it was a matter of principle. He couldn't handle the idea of his biological child being raised in another home, even by family. He said he couldn't live knowing his kid was out there, and he wasn't its father. We fought about it, badly. I told him he was being selfish, that he was denying my sister her only chance at happiness. But he wouldn't budge." "When was this argument?" "About 2 weeks ago." We hadn't spoken about it since. We were trying to move past it. Family drama. The deepest wounds were always inflicted by the ones you loved. This was a motive Parker could understand. A powerful, emotional, desperate motive. "Can I have your sister's contact information?" Naya's head snapped up. "Why? Zira had nothing to do with this. She wouldn't hurt a fly." "Standard procedure," Parker repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, she recited Zira's name, number, and address. As Parker left the kitchen, Dempsey met him in the hallway. "Told you, domestic," he said with a smug nod. "It's always about a fight. She probably hired someone to do it and cooked up this alibi." "Maybe," Parker said noncommittally, "or maybe the sister and her husband got tired of waiting." He walked back into the living room, drawn again to the coffee table. He pointed the white mug out to the crime scene tech. "Bag this carefully. I want a full DNA workup on that lipstick and any prints you can pull." While the CSU team worked, Parker decided to start the neighborhood canvass himself. He crossed the wet street to the house directly opposite, a tidy brick ranch with perfectly trimmed hedges. An elderly man in a robe, Mr. Henderson, answered the door, his eyes wide with morbid curiosity. He had already been watching the commotion through his window. "Did you see or hear anything unusual at the Brooks house tonight, Mr. Henderson?" Parker asked. The old man stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Well, now that you mention it, it was strange. I saw Nia's car pull into her driveway." Parker's senses went on high alert. "When was this?" "Around 10 p.m., I'd say. I was watching the news, saw her headlights cut across my window, thought it was odd, her being home so early from the hospital. The foundation of Nia's perfect alibi began to crack." "Are you certain it was her car? A silver Honda Accord?" "Absolutely," Henderson said with unwavering confidence. "Seen it 1,000 times. She got out, went inside, stayed for a while." He leaned in conspiratorially. "But here's the really funny part, Detective. About an hour later, maybe a little after 11, I saw the car back out and drive away. Didn't see her again until all this." He gestured to the police cars. "Started up." Parker felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. He thanked the neighbor and walked back across the street, the rain starting to fall harder. Nia Brooks hadn't been at Grady Memorial Hospital all night. She had been here, in this house, during the estimated time of death. She had lied, and in a murder investigation, lies were never just lies. They were hiding something much, much darker. The perfect alibi had just been blown to pieces, and Nia Brooks had just become his prime suspect. The next morning, the Atlanta humidity was already thick enough to taste. Parker drove his sedan to a modest, well-kept duplex in East Point, the address Nia had given him for her sister. Zira Raines and her husband, Tavon, lived in a world that felt miles away from the quiet tragedy of Sycamore Ridge Drive. Yet Parker knew the two were intrinsically, perhaps fatally, connected. Zira answered the door. She was smaller than Nia, with the same expressive eyes, but hers were shadowed by a profound, weary sadness. The house behind her smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, a stark contrast to the scent of death that still lingered in Parker's memory. On the walls were not pictures of children, but framed motivational quotes. "Hope is the thing with feathers. What is delayed is not denied." The living room was a shrine to a dream deferred. Bookshelves were crammed with titles like The Infertility Cure and It Starts with the Egg. Stacks of pamphlets from fertility clinics lay on the coffee table. It was a room suffocating with longing. Tavon Raines emerged from a hallway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed even on a Saturday morning, in a crisp polo shirt and slacks. He had the sharp, assessing eyes of a lawyer, which Parker later learned he was. His handshake was firm, his demeanor controlled, almost rigid. "Detective Parker," Tavon said, his voice smooth and professional. "This is a terrible tragedy. Elijah was a good man. We're just in shock." "I understand," Parker said, taking the seat they offered. "I need to talk to you about your request to Mr. Brooks." Zira's composure crumbled instantly. Her eyes welled with tears as she began to speak, her voice thick with years of accumulated pain. She recounted a grueling 8-year journey of hope and heartbreak, miscarriages, surgeries, the final, devastating diagnosis. "Elijah was our last chance," she whispered, twisting a ring on her finger. "He was family. We thought he would understand. We never wanted to cut him out. He could have been Uncle Elijah. He could have been a part of the child's life. But he just refused. As she spoke, Tavon placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that seemed less like comfort and more like a warning. He consistently steered the conversation, answering questions directed at his wife. What Zira means is, we were disappointed, of course, Tavon interjected smoothly. But we respected Elijah's decision. It was his body, his choice. We were prepared to look into other options. Other options? Parker asked, his gaze fixed on Tavon. Anonymous donors. It's more complicated, more expensive, but we were looking into it. We told Nia and Elijah we were moving on. There was a defensiveness in his tone that set Parker on edge. Mr. Raines, I understand you called Elijah on the night he was murdered. Tavon's calm facade tightened almost imperceptibly. I did. I thought maybe I could appeal to him one last time, man to man. I called him around 9:30 p.m. And how did that conversation go? Not well, Tavon admitted, his jaw clenching. He was dismissive. He said the subject was closed and that I was disrespecting his marriage by continuing to bring it up. He told me to stop pressuring his wife. Then he hung up on me. That must have made you angry, Parker stated, watching him closely. I was frustrated, detective. Not angry, Tavon corrected, his lawyerly precision kicking in. There's a difference. After the call, Zira and I talked, we had a glass of wine, and we decided to let it go for good. We put on a movie and went to bed around 11. We were home all night. Zira nodded in agreement, but her eyes were downcast, focused on her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked less like a corroborating witness and more like a student reciting a rehearsed answer. Tavon's overbearing presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, leaving no space for his wife's own voice. His story was neat, tidy, and completely self-serving. He painted himself as a reasonable man pushed to his limit, but ultimately accepting defeat. Parker didn't buy it. He saw a man accustomed to control, a man who had been told no one too many times. A man is told his final hope of having a family is gone, gets hung up on, and then that man just watches a movie? Parker mused aloud. Tavon's eyes narrowed. A flash of genuine anger broke through his polished exterior. Are you accusing me of something, detective? My wife is devastated. My brother-in-law is dead. And you're sitting here trying to twist our grief into a motive. I'm just trying to understand the timeline, Parker said calmly, though his internal alarm bells were ringing. Tavon's protectiveness of Zira was bordering on menacing. Was he protecting a fragile wife, or was he silencing a potential witness? The desperation in this house was a palpable force. It clung to the walls, settled on the furniture. It was the kind of desperation that could make people do unthinkable things. As he drove away, Parker couldn't shake the image of the couple. Zira, drowning in her sorrow, and Tavon, the stoic, controlling husband, fighting to keep them both afloat. Or was he the one who had pulled them all under? He had a motive, he had opportunity. His alibi was dependent solely on his wife's word, and he had a temper simmering just beneath the surface. The case was growing more complex with every interview. It was no longer just about Nia's lie. It was now a tangled web of family secrets, deep-seated resentment, and a relentless, all-consuming desire for a child. A desire that may have become powerful enough to kill for. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and stale paperwork. Parker sat at his desk, staring at the screen of his computer. On it was the surveillance footage from Grady Memorial Hospital's employee entrance, time-stamped from the night of the murder. He watched as the video played, his gut tightening with anticipation. There, at 9:43 p.m., was Nia Brooks. She wasn't running, wasn't looking over her shoulder. She walked with a determined stride, swiped her badge, and pushed through the glass doors out into the parking garage. The camera inside the garage picked her up a minute later, getting into her silver Honda Accord and driving away. Nearly 2 hours passed. Then, at 11:32 p.m., the same camera captured her car pulling back into its spot. She got out, smoothed her scrubs, and walked back into the hospital with the same measured pace. The lie was confirmed in grainy, black-and-white reality. He brought Nia into an interrogation room at the precinct. The room was small, gray, and designed to make people feel insignificant. She sat across the table from him, her face pale, her hands trembling. Her lawyer, a public defender with tired eyes, sat beside her. "Mrs. Brooks," Parker began, his voice even, "we need to talk about your alibi." He turned the laptop around and pressed play. He didn't say a word, just let the video roll. He watched Nia's face as she saw herself leaving the hospital. Her eyes widened, her breath hitched, the color drained from her cheeks, and she looked down at the table, defeated. When the video finished, Parker stopped it. "You told me, your fellow officers, and the CSU team that you never left the hospital. This video shows you were gone for nearly 2 hours, from 9:43 p.m. to 11:32 p.m. The medical examiner places the time of death for your husband between 10:30 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. You were gone during the exact window he was killed. I want you to tell me what really happened." Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, but Nia shook her head. The fight had gone out of her. Tears streamed down her face as she finally spoke, her voice broken. "I lied," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I lied. I was so scared." "Scared of what, Nia?" Parker asked, using her first name to build a sliver of rapport. "Scared of how it would look." "Exactly how it looks right now," she cried. "I couldn't stop thinking about our fight, about Zira. I needed to talk to him again. I thought if I could just see him face to face, I could make him understand. So I slipped out during a lull. I drove home." The confession hung in the air. "And what happened when you got there?" "He let me in. He was surprised to see me. We sat in the living room. We had coffee." She gestured vaguely. "I made a fresh pot. We talked. I begged him, Keishan, detective. I begged him to reconsider, for Zira, for our family." "Did you argue?" "Yes," she admitted, her voice cracking. "It got heated. He accused me of caring more about my sister than our marriage. He said I was trying to manipulate him. I told him he was cold and heartless. Horrible things were said." She buried her face in her hands. "Then, I just gave up. I knew I couldn't change his mind. I told him I had to get back to work. I left. I swear to you, detective, when I walked out that door around 11 o'clock, he was alive. He was angry, but he was alive." Her story fit the timeline. It explained her presence, the coffee cups, the lipstick. It was plausible. But it was also the exact story a guilty person would tell. Why lie, Nia? If you left him alive, why not just tell us the truth from the beginning? "Because I knew," she said, her voice rising with hysteria. "I knew you'd find out about our fight over Zira. I knew my alibi was my only protection. I panicked. I just wanted to rewind the clock, to pretend I had never left the hospital at all. I found him. And I knew I would be the first person you'd suspect." Parker studied her. Her story was compelling. Her remorse seemed genuine. But the facts were damning. She had motive, opportunity, and she had already proven she was willing to lie to the police. While he was questioning Nia, a report from the ballistics lab landed on his desk. The bullet pulled from the wall behind where Elijah fell was a 9mm, fired from a polymer frame handgun, but the key finding was in the details. The firing pin marks and rifling patterns were inconsistent with major manufacturers. The bullet had been fired from a ghost gun, a privately made firearm with no serial number, impossible to trace. This changed everything. A ghost gun wasn't a weapon of passion, grabbed in a moment of rage. It was a killer's tool. It suggested premeditation. It suggested someone who wanted to commit a murder and get away with it. This wasn't a simple argument that spiraled out of control. Someone had planned this. He looked at Nia, her shoulders slumped in despair. Was this weeping, terrified nurse capable of such cold, calculated planning? Or had she walked into a trap? Her story about leaving Elijah alive around 11 p.m. suddenly seemed more credible. Her neighbor had seen her car leave then. The hospital cameras confirmed her return at 11:32 p.m. That left a narrow 30-minute window for the murder to occur, a window in which Nia was demonstrably not at the scene. If Nia wasn't the killer, then she had argued with her husband and left him alive, only for the real murderer to arrive minutes later. The wall of lies had crumbled, but instead of revealing a clear culprit, it had only opened up a darker, more terrifying possibility. A calculated killer was still out there, hiding in the shadows of this family's grief. Elijah Brooks's rigid principle was the stone that had started this deadly ripple. To understand why a man would refuse to help a desperate family member, Parker knew he had to understand the man himself. The investigation in Atlanta had hit a wall of he said, she said, so he decided to dig into the place where Elijah's principles were forged, the red clay soil of rural South Georgia. He spent hours on the phone, chasing down old records and distant relatives. He spoke to an aunt in Valdosta who remembered Elijah as a serious, quiet boy, one who felt things deeper than most. It was a lead from a retired sheriff in a small county outside Macon that finally cracked open the past. The sheriff remembered the Brooks family, not for any crime, but for a tragedy that the town had whispered about for years. "Yeah, Lynette Brooks," the old sheriff said, his voice crackling over the line. "Elijah's older sister. Got herself in trouble when she was 16. The family was real church-going, real proud. They couldn't have that kind of shame." The story unfolded through dusty court documents and sealed social services files that Parker had to pull strings to access. At 16, Lynette had given birth to a baby boy. Under immense pressure from her parents, she was forced to sign adoption papers. The child was given away, and Lynette was sent to live with relatives in another state until the scandal died down. She never fully recovered. But the most haunting detail was Elijah's role. At just 14 years old, he was listed as a witness. He was the one who found his sister after she had tried to harm herself. He was the one who sat in a cold, sterile room while social workers asked him questions he couldn't possibly understand. He had watched his sister's heart break, watched his nephew be handed over to strangers, and he had been powerless to stop it. He had carried that weight his entire life. Parker leaned back in his chair, the sterile report on his screen painting a vivid picture of teenage trauma. Elijah's refusal wasn't about selfishness or a lack of compassion. It was a scar, a deep psychological wound that had never healed. He wasn't just refusing Zira. He was refusing to relive the most painful moment of his life. He was refusing to participate in another scenario where a child with his blood grew up calling someone else father. His principle wasn't an abstract idea. It was a ghost. The revelation recontextualized everything, but it didn't bring him any closer to the killer. He was still stuck. Nia had an alibi for the likely time of the murder. Tavon and Zira had a weak, shared alibi. The weapon was a ghost gun. The case was a tangled mess. That afternoon, a call came in from a patrol officer who had been recanvassing the neighborhood, showing photos of Nia's and Tavon's cars. A woman who lived 2 houses down, Mrs. Gable, had been out of town but had just returned. She hadn't seen Nia's Honda, but she had seen something else. Parker drove back to the quiet, tree-lined street. Mrs. Gable was a nervous woman who clutched her small dog as she spoke. "I was getting back late that night," she explained, petting the dog's head. "My flight was delayed. It must have been around 11:15 p.m. when I pulled into my driveway." Parker's pen froze. 11:15 p.m., after Nia had already left. "I saw a car parked a little ways down the street from their house," she continued. "It was a dark sedan, maybe a blue or a black. I couldn't be sure in the dark. It wasn't a car I recognized." "Did you see anyone get in or out?" Parker asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I saw a man," she said. "He got out of the driver's side. He was tall, thin-build. He was wearing a dark hoodie, so I couldn't see his face. He walked up to the Brooks front door. This was it. This was the person who arrived after Nia left." "Did he knock?" "No," Mrs. Gable said, shaking her head. "That was the strange thing. He just stood on the porch for a moment, looked around, and then walked right in, like he had a key." A key. The circle of suspects who might have a key was vanishingly small. Family. Zira and Tavon. Parker thanked the woman and walked back to his car, his mind racing. Tavon was tall and thin. He drove a dark blue Ford Fusion. He had a powerful motive and had been on the phone with Elijah just hours before the murder. He claimed he was at home, but a witness now placed a man matching his description, driving a car matching his, at the crime scene during the exact time of the murder. The ghost from Elijah's past had explained the why of the conflict, but Mrs. Gable's testimony had just provided a potential who. The image was becoming clearer. Nia leaves, emotionally distraught. Minutes later, Tavon arrives, armed with a key, a ghost gun, and a burning rage from being dismissed and disrespected. He lets himself in, expecting another confrontation, but this time He's come prepared to ensure he gets the final word. Parker started the car, a new sense of purpose driving him. He was no longer just investigating a family dispute. He was hunting a killer who had used a family's pain as a cover for a cold, premeditated murder. The ghost of the past had set the stage, but it was the actions of the living that had turned tragedy into a crime, and Parker was getting closer to finding out who had pulled the trigger. Days turned into a week, and the momentum of the investigation slowed to a crawl. The case against Tavon Raines was circumstantial, built on a shaky eyewitness account and a strong motive. His dark sedan wasn't unique, and without a positive ID on the man in the hoodie, Parker's theory was just that, a theory. Tavon and Zira had lawyered up, refusing any further interviews. The trail was going cold. The crime scene had been processed and released back to the family, but Parker couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something. The ghost gun was a dead end, untraceable by design. Forensics had swept the house, but the killer had been clean. Too clean. There were no foreign fingerprints, no stray hairs, no fibers left behind. It was as if a phantom had entered the house, killed Elijah, and vanished without a trace. Dempsey was ready to move on. "Look, Keshen," he'd said over coffee that morning, "the wife lied, the brother-in-law is shady as hell. We push the DA, see if they'll bite on what we have for Tavon. If not, it goes in the cold case pile. We've got fresh bodies dropping every day." Parker bristled at the suggestion. Quitting wasn't in his DNA. "We're not there yet, Bill. Something was left at that scene. There has to be." Frustration gnawed at him. He spread the crime scene photos across his desk for the 100th time. The living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom. He stared at the photos of the bathroom, where Nia had claimed she went to splash water on her face after her argument with Elijah. The techs had luminol tested the sink and found no traces of blood. Everything was pristine. Too pristine. An idea began to form in his mind, a long shot born of desperation. He'd seen it work once before on a kidnapping case where the victim had been moved. He picked up his phone and made a call to the K-9 unit supervisor. The next afternoon, Parker stood outside the Brooks house on Sycamore Ridge Drive. The yellow tape was gone, replaced by a funereal stillness. He was met by Officer Miller, a lean, wiry woman with a quiet confidence, and her partner, a magnificent German shepherd named Shadow. The dog sat patiently by her side, his intelligent eyes focused intently on his handler, waiting for a command. "He's a cadaver dog," Miller explained, "but he's also trained for scent tracking and evidence detection. If your killer dropped so much as a piece of lint from his pocket, Shadow might find it." Parker nodded. "The killer entered through the front door. The murder happened here in the living room. We believe the killer left the same way, but we found nothing. I'm hoping Shadow can find a trail we missed." Miller gave the dog a command, "Such," German for seek, and presented him with a vacuum-sealed bag containing a shirt Elijah had worn, retrieved from his laundry hamper. Shadow sniffed it deeply, committing the scent to memory. Then Miller gave another command, this time presenting a sterile gauze pad. "Find friend," she said, her voice calm and encouraging. The dog was now tasked with finding Elijah's scent, and anything that didn't belong with it. They started in the living room. Shadow moved with a focused intensity that was mesmerizing to watch. He swept the room in a grid pattern, his nose twitching, taking in a world of information Parker couldn't even imagine. He lingered on the blood-stained spot on the rug, letting out a low whine, acknowledging the scent of death. He followed a faint trail to the front door, and then stopped, sniffing the air, confused. He paced back and forth, but the trail was gone, washed away by the rain and the passage of time. Dempsey, who had come along to observe, scoffed. "Told you it was a waste of time, Parker." Parker ignored him, his eyes on the dog. Miller let Shadow work, not rushing him. The dog suddenly turned, leaving the living room and heading down the hallway with a new sense of purpose. He bypassed the master bedroom and went straight to the small guest bathroom at the end of the hall. This was the bathroom Parker had stared at in the photos, the one that was unnervingly clean. Shadow entered the bathroom and immediately became agitated. He sniffed the floor, the toilet, the sink. Then, he stood on his hind legs, placing his massive paws on the tiled wall of the shower, and began to bark. It wasn't a loud, aggressive bark, but a sharp, insistent sound. He barked and then began to scratch at the wall, his claws making a scraping noise against the tile. "What's he got?" Parker asked, moving closer. "I don't know," Miller said, looking puzzled. "He's alerting on something inside the wall." She ran her hand over the tiles Shadow was indicating. "Feels solid." Parker looked closer. The tiles were standard white ceramic. But as he examined the grout lines, he saw it. A faint, almost invisible hairline crack around one of the tiles. It was a removable panel, disguised as part of the wall. The original crime scene text, focused on visible surfaces, had missed it completely. "Get a crowbar," Parker said, his heart starting to pound. A patrol officer returned with a small pry bar. Parker carefully inserted the edge into the crack and leveraged it. The tile popped loose with a soft sucking sound, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. Reaching inside, his fingers brushed against something wrapped in cloth. He pulled it out. It was a heavy object, wrapped in a blue dish towel. As Parker carefully unwrapped it, the object was revealed. A black polymer frame handgun. It had no serial number. It was the ghost gun. Dempsey was silent, his cynical smirk gone. Officer Miller praised Shadow, who wagged his tail, pleased with himself. The cold trail had suddenly become white-hot. The killer hadn't been a phantom after all. They had been clever, hiding the murder weapon in a place no one would think to look, but they hadn't accounted for the extraordinary senses of a German shepherd named Shadow. The gun, Parker knew, was the key. And now, he finally had it in his hands. The discovery of the ghost gun sent a jolt of electricity through the investigation. It was immediately sent to the GBI crime lab for a full workup. Parker waited, the hours stretching into an eternity. The gun was their first and only piece of hard evidence, a silent witness that was about to tell its story. The call from the lab came late the next day. The ballistics matched. It was definitively the murder weapon, but the forensic analysis of the gun itself yielded a stunning, contradictory result. "We lifted 2 sets of partial fingerprints from the grip and the slide," the lab tech explained over the phone. "They're smudged, layered on top of each other, like 2 different people handled it. We ran the first set through AFIS. We got a match, Keshan, a direct hit." Parker leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "Who is it?" "Nia Brooks." The name hit Parker like a physical blow. Nia, the grieving widow with the broken alibi. Her prints were on the murder weapon. "What about the second set of prints?" "No match in the system," the tech replied. "They're partials, not enough for a positive ID on their own, but enough to know they belong to a different person. We're still working on pulling a DNA profile from skin cells on the trigger." Parker hung up the phone, his mind reeling. How could Nia's prints be on a gun she swore she'd never seen? A gun hidden so cleverly in her own home? Dempsey's initial theory, the one Parker had dismissed as lazy and prejudiced, suddenly seemed terrifyingly plausible. Had Nia played him? Was her grief, her fear, her confession of a lie, all part of an elaborate, cold-blooded performance? He brought her back to the precinct. This time, there was no gentle questioning. She sat in the same gray room, but the atmosphere was different. It was colder, harder. Her lawyer sat beside her, looking grim. "We found the gun, Nia," Parker said, his voice flat and devoid of the sympathy he'd shown before. "It was hidden in your bathroom wall. The ballistics team confirmed it's the weapon that killed your husband." Nia stared at him, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine confusion. I don't understand. I told you, we didn't own a gun." "Then maybe you can explain this," Parker said, sliding a copy of the forensic report across the table. "Your fingerprints are all over it." She looked down at the report, her brow furrowed. She read the words, and a strangled gasp escaped her lips. No, that's impossible. I've never touched a gun in my life. It's a mistake. It has to be." "The lab doesn't make mistakes like this," Parker said, his voice like ice. "You lied about being at the hospital. Now it seems you've been lying about everything else too." "I'm not lying," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "I swear to you, I did not kill my husband." "Someone is setting me up," her lawyer jumped in. "Detective, my client maintains her innocence. The presence of her fingerprints could be explained in any number of ways. Perhaps the killer wore gloves and attempted to frame her by planting her prints." "Frame her? How?" Dempsey shot back from the corner. "Did the killer break into her locker at the hospital, steal her gloves, and then use them? It's absurd." But Nia seized on the idea, her eyes wild. Maybe Elijah wasn't the man I thought he was. The words tumbled out of her in a frantic rush. He was a financial analyst. He worked with wealthy people, shady people. What if he was in trouble? What if someone came to the house and they killed him? And they knew I would be the primary suspect, so they found a way to put my prints on the gun to frame me. It was a desperate, far-fetched theory, but Parker didn't dismiss it outright. The second set of unidentified prints on the gun was a nagging, unanswered question. If Nia was the killer, whose prints were those? Then, Nia offered another, more painful possibility. Or maybe, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes again. Maybe he was seeing someone else. The thought seemed to cause her physical pain. That lipstick on the coffee mug, it wasn't my shade. I wear nude tones, never dark red. What if he had another woman over? What if she's the one who killed him? What if she fought with him, and he grabbed a gun he had hidden, and she took it from him and shot him? The theory was a mess of speculation, but it introduced two crucial elements. The idea that the lipstick wasn't hers, and the possibility that Elijah owned the gun, contrary to her initial statements. It could be a desperate attempt to deflect blame, or it could be the truth. Parker leaned back, studying her. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She had motive, she had opportunity. Her prints were on the weapon, and she was a known liar. Any DA would have a field day with this case. It was the classic story of a scorned wife. Yet, something still felt wrong. Her denial felt too raw, too real, and the presence of those other prints, the ghost in the machine, couldn't be ignored. The gun had spoken, and it had named Nia Brooks, but a voice in the back of Parker's mind told him it wasn't telling the whole story. There was another person in this deadly equation. The owner of the second set of fingerprints, the woman who wore dark red lipstick. The investigation had zeroed in on Nia, but Parker had a sinking feeling they were looking at only one half of a conspiracy, or worse, at a woman who had been perfectly and diabolically framed. With Nia Brooks's claims of being framed hanging in the air, the investigation pivoted back to its other prime suspect, Tavon Raines. The unidentified second set of prints on the gun could belong to anyone, but the man with the most to gain from Elijah's death, the man seen at the house on the night of the murder, was Tavon. The killer was a woman, but it wasn't Nia Brooks. The entire case, so carefully constructed, shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't Tavon. The furious husband with the violent past was a red herring. The killer was a woman. But if it wasn't Nia, the wife whose prints were on the gun, then who was it? There was only one other woman at the heart of this tragedy. A woman whose grief and desperation were so profound, so all-consuming, that Parker had seen her as a victim, not a suspect. Zira. The lab result changed the entire gravitational pull of the case. A female killer, not Nia. Parker sat in his office late into the night, the city lights of Atlanta glittering outside his window like 1,000 scattered diamonds. He stared at the whiteboard where the faces of the key players were pinned. Elijah, the victim, Nia, the liar, Tavon, the red herring, and Zira, the grieving, fragile sister, the one everyone was trying to protect. Everything clicked into place with the force of a physical impact. The pieces of the puzzle, which had seemed so disconnected, now rearranged themselves into a new, horrifying picture. The two sets of fingerprints on the gun, Nia's and an unknown person's. The female DNA under Elijah's fingernails. Nia's frantic, desperate lies. They weren't lies of guilt. They were lies of protection. She hadn't lied to save herself. She had lied to save her sister. Parker thought back to his first interview with Nia in her kitchen. The flicker of anger in her eyes when he asked about family problems. Her fierce, almost primal defense of Zira. She wouldn't hurt a fly, she had said. But desperation can turn anyone into something they're not. He remembered the shrine-like living room at Zira and Tavon's house, the air thick with the weight of her childlessness. The timeline replayed in his head with terrifying clarity. Nia goes to the house at 10 p.m. She argues with Elijah. She leaves around 11 p.m., emotionally shattered. What does a person do in that state? They call the one person in the world who would understand their pain. They call their sister. He pulled the phone records again, this time looking at them through this new lens. There it was. A 2-minute call from Nia's cell phone to Zira's at 11:10 p.m., right after Nia had left Elijah's house. Nia must have told her what happened, that Elijah was immovable, that their last hope was gone. And Zira, consumed by years of grief, hormonal treatments, and crushing disappointment, finally snapped. While Tavan was... where? Maybe he was home, oblivious. Or maybe his tirade at the station was a desperate act to protect his wife. Zira, fueled by a righteous rage, must have taken the spare key. She drove to Elijah's house. She was the tall, thin figure in the dark hoodie Mrs. Gable saw. She let herself in. Parker imagined the scene, the final confrontation. Not a calculated hit, but a raw, emotional explosion. Zira pleading, crying, screaming. Elijah standing firm on his traumatic principle, perhaps saying something cruel in the heat of the moment. A struggle. Elijah, a strong man, would have fought back, scratching her as he tried to defend himself. The ghost gun, maybe it was Elijah's after all, a secret he kept from his gun-hating wife for protection. In the struggle, Zira gets the gun. A flash, a bang, and silence. Then, panic. She calls the only person she can trust, Nia. Nia, the protector, the big sister. She would have told Zira what to do. Wipe everything down, hide the gun. And Nia, knowing the police would focus on her, began to construct a wall of lies, brick by painful brick, to shield her little sister from the consequences. She sacrificed her own innocence on the altar of sisterly love. It was a terrible, tragic, and deeply human story, and Parker knew he had to get Nia to tell it. He brought her in one last time. She looked exhausted, as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. He didn't sit across the table from her this time. He pulled up a chair beside her. There were no files, no photos, no evidence between them. "Nia," he began softly, his voice full of a weariness that matched her own. "We're done with the lies. I'm not here to accuse you. I'm here because I think I finally understand." She looked at him, her eyes guarded. Parker decided to apply pressure. He got a warrant for Tavan's car, the dark blue Ford Fusion. The forensics team swarmed it, searching for any trace of evidence. A stray fiber, a speck of gunpowder, anything that tied him to the crime scene. They also got a warrant for his DNA and fingerprints. He brought Tavan in for a second interrogation. This time, Tavan didn't have the protective shield of his wife's presence. He walked into the gray room alone, his lawyer by his side, his usual composure replaced by a visible, simmering anger. "This is harassment, detective," Tavan said, before Parker could even speak. "You are targeting me and my family because you can't build a real case against anyone else." "I'm targeting the evidence, Mr. Raines," Parker said coolly, sliding a photo across the table. It was a still from a traffic camera a few blocks from Elijah's house, time-stamped at 11:18 p.m. on the night of the murder. The image was grainy, but it clearly showed a dark sedan, identical to Tavan's, turning onto Sycamore Ridge Drive. A car matching yours, heading toward the crime scene, minutes after Nia Brooks left. Another witness saw a man matching your description enter the house with a key Nia confirmed she had given you and your wife for emergencies. Tavan stared at the photo, his jaw tight. "That's not my car. It's a common model, and that witness is mistaken. I was at home with my wife." "Your alibi is your wife, who is the sister of the prime suspect and has a vested interest in the outcome of this investigation. It's not exactly airtight," Parker countered. The pressure was working. Tavan's mask of lawyerly calm was cracking. His fingers drummed a frantic, impatient rhythm on the steel table. Parker decided to push harder, bringing up a sealed juvenile record he'd uncovered. "It says here that when you were 17, you were arrested for aggravated assault. A fight over a girl that put another kid in the hospital with a broken jaw. It seems you have a history of letting your temper get the best of you, especially when you don't get what you want." That was the spark that lit the fuse. Tavan shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That was sealed! You have no right. This is exactly what this is about, isn't it?" He spat, his voice laced with venom. "You see a successful black man, a lawyer, with a nice car and a beautiful wife, and you can't stand it. You have to find a way to tear him down. You people are all the same. You see a black body on the ground, and the first person you look for is the next successful black man to blame. It's the story of America." His lawyer tried to calm him down, but Taubman was furious. His tirade a mix of genuine outrage and, Parker suspected, calculated deflection. He was using the very real specter of systemic racism as a shield. It was a powerful, polarizing accusation, one designed to put Parker, another black man, on the defensive. But Parker had heard it before. He'd seen guilty men wrap themselves in the flag of racial injustice to hide their crimes. "This isn't about race, Mr. Raines," Parker said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is about Elijah Brooks lying dead on his living room floor, and you had a very powerful reason to want him there." "My reason was to build a family, not destroy one," Taubman shot back. The interrogation ended there, with Tavon storming out, shouting about filing a harassment complaint. Parker was left in the quiet room, the man's angry words still echoing. He was almost certain Tavon was the killer. The anger, the history of violence, the circumstantial evidence, it all pointed to him. He must have forced Nia to handle the gun at some point. Or perhaps her prints were already on it, from a time she had handled it innocently, and he knew that. He was smart, manipulative, and knew exactly which buttons to push. Parker felt a grim satisfaction. The case was finally coming together. He just needed one more piece to lock it down. The DNA. He was back at his desk when the call he'd been waiting for came. It was the GBI lab again. "Keishan, we've got the results from the DNA found under Elijah's fingernails," the tech said. He put up a fight. He scratched his killer. "Run it against Tavon Raines," Parker said, already anticipating the match. This was the nail in the coffin. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We already did," the tech said. "It's not a match." Parker felt the air leave his lungs. "What? Run it again." "We did. It's not Tavon. And we ran it against Nia Brooks, just to be sure. It's not her either." The tech hesitated for a moment before delivering the final, baffling blow. "Keishan, the DNA profile is female. I know you didn't kill your husband," he continued. "And I know your prints are on that gun. And I know you've been lying to me since the moment I met you. But you haven't been lying to protect a killer. You've been lying to protect your sister." Her composure, held together for so long by sheer force of will, shattered. A low, guttural sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure anguish. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. "Love is a powerful thing, Nia," Parker said, his voice quiet. "The love for a husband, the love for a sister. Sometimes they pull you in different directions. You've been trying to protect Zira your whole life, haven't you? From playground bullies to the disappointments of life. It's second nature to you." Tears streamed down her face, but she remained silent. "The DNA under Elijah's nails belongs to a woman," Parker said, laying the final card on the table. "We will get a warrant for Zira's DNA. It will be a match. We will find her prints on that gun alongside yours. It's over. You can't carry this for her anymore. This sacrifice, it won't save her. It will only destroy you both." He slid a notepad and a pen in front of her. "Tell me what happened. Tell me the truth. Not for me, for you, and for Zira. The truth is all you have left." Nia stared at the notepad, her shoulders shaking. The battle within her was visible on her face. Loyalty against truth, love against law. Finally, with a deep, shuddering sigh of surrender, she picked up the pen. The sacrifice was over. The truth, in all its devastating ugliness, was about to come out. Zira Raines sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, the metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. The fight had gone out of her. When the police arrived at her door, she hadn't resisted. She had simply nodded, a silent admission of a fate she knew was coming. After learning that Nia had confessed to protecting her, Zira agreed to make a full statement. Parker sat across from her, a tape recorder running between them. Zira's voice was a monotone, a stark contrast to the explosive emotions that had led her to this room. She recounted the story of that night not as a confession of a crime, but as a tragedy in which she was the final, fatal actor. "Nia called me after she left Elijah's," Zira began, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind Parker's head. "She was hysterical. She said it was over, that he wouldn't budge, and that he'd said their marriage was suffering because she was so obsessed with my problem. He made it sound like I was a disease, something that was infecting her life. The words even recounted were filled with venom. Broke, she whispered. All those years, the needles, the appointments, the hope, the crushing disappointment, over and over again. And he had the solution. It was so easy for him. And he said no. And then he had the audacity to blame me for his marital problems. It was too much. So you went to his house? Parker prompted gently. She nodded. Tavon was in the shower. I didn't even tell him where I was going. I just took the car keys and the spare house key Nia had given us. I was running on pure rage. I wasn't thinking. I just knew I had to face him. I had to make him see the pain he was causing. She described arriving at the house, using the key to let herself in. Elijah was in the living room, reading a book, the 2 half-empty coffee mugs still on the table. He was startled, then angry to see her. He told me to leave, Zira said, her voice trembling. He said I was trespassing, that I was harassing him. I started screaming at him. I called him a selfish monster. I told him he was destroying our family. And then he said the thing that changed everything. She paused, swallowing hard. He looked at me, with this cold look in his eyes, and he said, "You know, Nia deserves better. She deserves better than a sister who uses her and manipulates her. You're ruining her marriage, and for what? For a baby you can't even have on your own." He called my dream a fantasy. In that moment, Zira's carefully constructed narrative of victimhood shattered. She was no longer just a desperate sister. She was a woman whose deepest wound had been salted and scorned. Something inside me just went silent, she said. The rage turned into something cold. I saw red. I told him he would regret saying that. He told me to get out of his house. I refused. I followed him as he walked toward the bedroom, still yelling. This was a new detail. The murder hadn't happened entirely in the living room. He went into the bedroom? Parker asked. Yes, he went to his closet. I thought he was getting something to throw at me, but he reached behind a stack of shoeboxes and pulled out a small safe. He quickly opened it and pulled out a gun. Zira's eyes filled with tears. Nia never knew. He bought it a few months ago after a neighbor was burglarized. He kept it a secret from her because he knew how much she hated guns. He threatened you with it? No, she shook her head. He just held it. He told me, Zira, it's time for you to leave, now. It wasn't a threat. It was a final terrible warning. But I didn't see it that way. I saw it as him trying to silence me, to control me. I lunged for it. I don't even know why. I just wanted to take his power away. The scene she described was chaos. A desperate struggle in the bedroom doorway. Elijah, stronger, trying to keep the gun away from her. Zira, fueled by adrenaline and rage, clawing, scratching, fighting with a strength she didn't know she possessed. That was when he must have gotten her DNA under his fingernails. We stumbled back out into the living room, both of us with our hands on the gun, she sobbed. He was trying to pry my fingers off. He was yelling my name. His face was right in front of mine. He looked scared, not of me, but for me. And then there was a bang. It was so loud. Her narrative stopped. The memory was too much. I don't remember pulling the trigger, she whispered. I just remember the sound and the recoil. The gun flew out of my hands, and Elijah, he looked down at his chest. He had this look of surprise, the same look he had when I first walked in. He looked at me, and he tried to say something, but only blood came out. Then he fell. Silence descended in the interrogation room. Zira was weeping openly now, the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. I just stood there. For how long, I don't know. Then I panicked. I knew Nia would be the first suspect. I saw the dish towel in the kitchen, and I used it to pick up the gun. I remembered her telling me once about a loose tile in the bathroom, where they had hidden cash for an emergency. I ran in there, pulled it open, and shoved the gun inside. I put the tile back. Then I just ran. I drove home, shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. She had confessed to everything. It wasn't a premeditated murder. It was a tragedy born of a perfect storm of pain, rage, and a secret weapon introduced at the worst possible moment. A story of two sisters, bound by a love so fierce that one was willing to kill for the other's dream, and the other was willing to go to prison to hide the crime. The legal process moved with a grim, inexorable logic. Faced with Zira's detailed confession, the DNA evidence, and Nia's corroborating testimony, the district attorney's office put together an ironclad case. There was no trial. Zira Raines, advised by her lawyer that a jury would have little sympathy, accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, the charge reflecting the crime's passionate, unpremeditated nature. A judge, citing the tragic circumstances but also the sanctity of human life, sentenced her to 15 years in a state prison. Nia Brooks faced her own day in court. She pleaded guilty to a felony charge of obstruction of justice. Her defense painted her as a woman acting out of a misguided but powerful love for her sister, a woman already shattered by the loss of her husband. The judge was lenient, sentencing her to 5 years of probation, extensive community service, and mandatory grief counseling. She was free, but she would never be free. She had lost her husband, and now she was losing her sister to the prison system, all because of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. Tavon, cleared of any involvement, quietly filed for divorce from his incarcerated wife and moved out of state, disappearing from their lives forever. The case was closed. The paperwork was filed. The evidence logged away. Detective Cation Parker sat in his car one evening, parked across the street from the now empty house on Sycamore Ridge Drive. A for sale sign was staked in the manicured lawn, a stark announcement that the life once lived within those walls was over. He opened the case file on the passenger seat, the faces of Elijah, Nia, and Zira staring up at him. It was a clean close, a win in the stat book, but it felt hollow. There was no satisfaction, only a profound sense of waste. He thought about Dempsey's initial cynicism, another domestic gone sideways. In a way, the cynical old detective had been right. It was a domestic dispute, but it was so much more complicated than the simple, ugly stereotype he'd imagined. It wasn't born of simple hatred, but of a complex, distorted love. Parker started his car and pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet house behind. The lesson of the case settled heavily in his mind. It was a story about principles and the danger of holding them so tightly that they leave no room for compassion. Elijah's principle, born from a deep and valid trauma, had become an unyielding wall. He was so determined to prevent the ghosts of his past from repeating themselves that he couldn't see the real, present pain of the people he loved. He had forgotten that principles, without empathy, can become a form of cruelty. But the more profound lesson was about the nature of love itself, the fierce, unbreakable bond between two sisters. A love that was their greatest strength had become their fatal flaw. Zira's desperate love for a child she would never have, and Nia's sacrificial love for the sister who had always been her anchor, had created a vortex of grief and rage that had consumed them all. Love, in its purest form, is meant to create and nurture life. But when twisted by desperation and pain, Parker reflected, it can become the most destructive force on Earth. There were no villains in this story, not really. There were only broken people, making terrible choices for reasons they believed, in their darkest moments, were right. And that, he knew, was the most enduring tragedy of all.